All right, we're learning more this morning about Donald Trump's final days in office. There is new reporting from the Washington Post that the nation's top military officer, Joint Chiefs Chairman Mark Milley, worried about what Donald Trump might try to do to hold on to power after losing re-election. The account is detailed in the upcoming book by Post reporters Carol Leonnig and Philip Rucker, entitled "I Alone Can Fix It," which is a quote by Donald Trump. Here's how the Post summarized the account. Quote, after attending a November 10th security briefing about the Million MAGA March, a pro-Trump rally protesting the election, Milley said he feared an American equivalent of brown shirts in the streets, alluding to the paramilitary forces that protected Nazi rallies and enabled Hitler's ascent. Late that same evening, according to the book, an old friend called Milley to express concerns that those close to Trump were attempting to, quote, overturn the government. You're one of the few guys who are standing between us and some really bad stuff, the friend told Milley, according to an account relayed to his aides. Milley was shaken. Leonnig and Rucker write, and he called former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster to ask whether a coup was actually imminent. What the F am I dealing with? Milley asked him. The conversations put Milley on edge, and he began informally planning with other military leaders, strategizing on how they would block Trump's order to use the military in a way they deemed dangerous or illegal. If someone wanted to seize control, Milley thought, they would need to gain sway over the FBI, the CIA, and the Defense Department, where Trump had already installed staunch allies. They may try, but they're not going to effing succeed, he told some of his closest deputies, the book says. The book also details how Milley confronted then White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows at the annual Army-Navy football game about rumors that the president was preparing to replace then CIA Director Gina Haspel with a loyalist. What the hell is going on here? What are you guys doing? Don't worry about it, Meadows reassured him. Just be careful, Milley warned. Leonnig and Rucker report that the military chief spent weeks reassuring members of Congress and administration officials who shared his concerns. Everything's going to be okay. We're going to have a peaceful transfer of power. We're going to land this plane safely. This is America. It's strong. The institutions are bending, but it won't break. We should mention this account has not been independently confirmed by NBC News. Elizabeth, I'm hearing a lot in this book, in what I just read to our viewers and you, things that we talked about on this show, that we were directly concerned about in real time. You could see the fact that Trump had installed either loyalists or acting or empty spaces in the Defense Department, which then allowed him to push norms.
Yeah, I would say we haven't confirmed this either, but certainly it sounds very much like similar things we were reporting at the time. So I think there's a couple of things going on here. One is that President Trump always viewed the U.S. military as his military, not the people's military. He saw the generals as his generals, and never quite understood that the generals were loyal to the Constitution. Yes, Trump was commander-in-chief, but there was great fear at the Pentagon in the final days of the Trump administration about what might happen. I think that had there been some sort of an attempt to put the military was very concerned about Trump ordering them into the streets to somehow try to keep him to hold on to power. There was a lot of fear about that. And I think if that had ever happened, there would have been mass resignations at the top of the military. We would have had a crisis at that point. I also think that Milley stood up to Trump a number of times. Remember on June 1st, 2020, Trump wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act, which would put the military in the streets to quell riots and to quell protests, largely peaceful protests, I might add. And Milley talked Trump out of doing that. But they were very, very tense days in those final days. And, we're now learning from all these books just how how tense things got, how close things came. So I would say, and I think that General Milley is relieved now that there's a different president.
Jake Sherman, we've heard over the last several months a slow, sometimes quick, actually, whitewashing of what happened on January 6th, just how serious the threat was. But here's how serious General Milley took it in a meeting with law enforcement and military leaders after January 6th, before the inauguration on January 20th, according to quotes in the book. He said, here's the deal, guys. These guys are Nazis. They're Boogaloo boys. They're Proud Boys. They're the same people we fought in World War II. We're going to put a ring of steel around this city, and the Nazis are not getting in. That's General Milley quoted talking about the inauguration of President Joe Biden. It speaks to how seriously he believed a coup was still in play.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, if you remember at the time, the Capitol was enringed in a circle of fencing, and the city was on absolute lockdown. I know because I was there. And the military the National Guard and the D.C. police took a major role. And I remember on several occasions, Speaker Nancy Pelosi talking with General Milley and other military officials to make sure that they were going to protect the Capitol and protect the city on that day. So this really does fill in some of those details about what was going on behind the scenes to protect the Capitol from another insurrection.